Okay, so I think we'll begin. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's program is a special collaboration between the Blum Center and Mass General Hospital for Children. Before we get started, just wanted to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, feel free to visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that everyone is in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so that we can hear our guest speaker today. If you have any questions for the guest speaker, please use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff, the co-host, and guest speaker will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat box. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. So next, I would like to introduce you all to Brianna Beckfold. She is the project manager and editor for Mass General Hospital for Children, and she'll introduce you all to today's guest speaker.
Great, thank you, Amy. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you for coming to this virtual session of the MGH Parenting Series, where experts share their knowledge with patients, family, and staff on various pediatric health topics. And this year, we're co-hosting the series with the Blum Patient and Family Learning Center at Mass General. Like Amy said, my name is Brianna Beckfold, and I'm a project manager and editor at Mass General Hospital for Children, which is the pediatric branch of Mass General. And today we have Dr. Aude Henin from the Department of Psychiatry here at Mass General. So before we begin, I'll briefly introduce our speaker. Dr. Henin is the co-founder and co-director of the MGH Child Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Program in the Department of Psychiatry. She is also the director of the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Program in the Clinical and Research Program in Pediatric Psychopharmacology. She specializes in cognitive behavioral treatment of children and adolescents with mood, disruptive behavior, and anxiety disorders. Her research focuses on the efficacy of cognitive behavioral interventions of children, teens, and young adults with anxiety disorders and bipolar disorders, and longitudinal studies of children at risk of mood or anxiety disorders. She earned her PhD from Temple University and completed her fellowship here at Mass General. As Dr. Henin presents, we'll take questions from the audience in the chat box and we'll read them toward the end. And from here, I will hand it off to our speaker.
Thank you so much, Amy and Brianna, and thank you all for attending this meeting. I'm very grateful to be able to talk a little bit about some of our work around resiliency in youth, which has been especially important, well, always is important, but especially this past year as there have been so many challenges. So what I'm going to be doing is sharing some information about what resiliency is, some of the stressors that are impacting resiliency in youth, both historically and currently, and then some of the interventions and skills that we've been working on to help foster resiliency and stress management in youth. So one of the main questions that we have is, why does it seem that some individuals who experience adversity and significant stress seem to grow and thrive, whereas others experience debilitating distress and impairment? So what are some of the factors that can help promote the ability to withstand and to continue to grow despite challenges throughout the lifespan? And one of the things that we know is that humans are designed to deal with, or historically or evolutionarily designed to deal with stressors that are brief and potentially acute, but then resolve. And the kinds of stressors that are more common these days tend to be lower level, but chronic and unremitting. And so one of the theories is that the nature of the stressors that we're facing and that children are facing are different from what we're really designed to deal with. And that's why we're seeing physical and emotional and behavioral signs of this stress, because it really is quite difficult to deal with. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a second. So common stressors for kids and young people include challenges at home with family members, both immediate and extended. School has always and continues to be a source of great stress. for kids and teens, peer relationships, stressors around extracurricular activities and pursuits, worries about safety and health and finances and discrimination are also ongoing and chronic sources of stress for many youth. Just to kind of highlight, this was pre-pandemic, so this was a few years ago. What we're starting to see are that teenagers are reporting levels of stress that are similar to what adults are reporting and that exceed what we would consider to be a healthy amount of stress. And I'll talk about this idea of healthy amount of stress again and again, but we know that the goal is not to have no stress. So a certain amount of stress is actually a good thing, right? It challenges the organism to adapt. It can be motivating. But what can happen is that when stress is chronic or overly elevated, especially over time, that's really when we start to think of it as being unhealthy. And that's really what we're seeing in our young people. In the same survey, about a third of teens reported that they felt overwhelmed. 30% said they felt sad or depressed. About the same number reported feeling tired or fatigued. So those are some of the consequences of this chronic elevated stress that we're seeing. And most kids reported that their stress increased rather than decreased over the past year. And nearly half of teens said they weren't sure whether they were doing enough to manage their stress or weren't managing their stress effectively. So clearly there's a need to help young people learn tools to do so. Now, this was pre-pandemic. And so now with the events of the past year, we do know that stress levels have increased for parents and kids. And some of the studies that have come out over the past year or 15 months show that certainly kids were experiencing significant life changes during COVID, and that those life changes, were associated with increases in depressive symptoms. And one interesting study out of England showed that within a couple of months of some of the pandemic and some of the associated life changes, young people had significantly increased mental health care needs. So these aren't just sort of lower level symptoms, but for many youth, they really are rising to the level of needing care, which is challenging because care is often so limited. We also know that there are some instances where symptoms can become almost traumatic and where people can develop almost post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so one of those experiences has to do with quarantine. So not just sort of lockdown, but full out quarantine when people are worried that they're sick or that their loved ones are sick and that they can't leave their home. There's some data to suggest that for some kids and adults, that can even lead to really symptoms of trauma. We also want to recognize that the stress that families are experiencing aren't just for kids, but for parents as well. And so one study, the impact of COVID on caregivers, showed that about a quarter had significant, a quarter had moderate levels of distress, and nearly 30% had severe distress. So that's more than half of parents and caregivers. And that seemed to then also have an impact on kids, which is not surprising, right? That we know that how kids are doing is often linked to how parents are doing. And so this tells us that we also want to make sure that we're supporting families, not just kids through this pandemic. So some of the stressors, and some of these will be pretty obvious to many of you, include loss of daily structure. A lot of things that were important to kids and families were taken away, right? There was a lot of loss for kids of everyday events, and in some cases, major life events that you can't just kind of get back: graduations, birthday celebrations, weddings, etc. There's also been a loss of exposure to peers and adult models, right? So all of the focus has been on parents and siblings or immediate family members, whoever you're living with, to kind of give you everything, which is a lot, and associated negative mood states, decreased access to medical and mental health care, and repeated exposure to media coverage. So a lot of kids were getting very stressed. It was kind of constantly on the news, constantly being talked about. And we know from previous studies that we've done that repeated exposure to distressing events can actually have a negative impact on child well-being. We did some research after 9/11 to really show that that was significant, especially for younger kids who may not understand that it's the same event that's being shown again and again, and may sort of worry that it's happening repeatedly. There's also some interesting data on some of the lifestyle effects of COVID and the social isolation. So not surprisingly, kids' screen time went up dramatically. I know in my own family that's been the case. So an average of 4 hours a day of screen time increase, and not surprisingly then decrease in physical activity, so more sitting around, increase in snacking and eating perhaps not the healthiest foods, irregular sleep times and delayed bedtimes. And these we know are associated over time with cardiovascular disease risks and also mental health outcomes, both short and long term. So these give us some more targets for some of our work. We want to change some of these lifestyle habits. We also know that COVID stressors have not impacted everyone in the same way. And so we know that individuals who are already experiencing high levels of stress because of racism or discrimination, because of economic instability or uncertainty, food insecurity, other forms of discrimination, and individuals who have already experienced previous trauma or loss, who have mental health or developmental concerns, are at higher risk for negative effects of COVID restrictions and COVID on their emotional well-being. And we also know that individuals who are in a period of transition, so there's been increased attention, for example, among older adolescents and young adults who are entering or graduating from college. COVID seems to have had a particular effect, and not a positive one, on individuals in this age range, which makes sense. So then, knowing all of this, the question is then, all right, so what can we do? And the first thing is to think about, well, what do we really want to think about resilience? What is resilience? Is it mental toughness? I sometimes hear about that, right? That sort of idea of grit. I don't know. I'm sort of disenchanted with grit. I think it's a little bit overrated these days. Is it an internal trait, something that you either possess or not? Is it psychological flexibility? Is it something you can learn? Is it something you have to do by yourself? Is it sort of allowing stress to just kind of roll off and not impact you? So I'm putting all of these up just so everyone can think a little bit for themselves how they would define it. Is it coping, staying calm, adapting in the face of stressors, not having any problems, which I don't think any of us want to have that be defined anymore. Is it growing despite adversity? So really thinking, how might you define it for yourself? So our perspective is that it is something that comes from the interaction both of what we would call nature, sort of predispositions, and nurture. So we do know that there are some things that internally might make it more likely that someone will be resilient or not. But I think we also tend to overestimate how much of this is sort of a trait that just people possess. We also know that experiences matter, and that people who are resilient tend to be fortunate enough to have loving, responsive, consistent, predictable conditions during childhood, have, as I talked about, reasonable opportunities to manage challenges and stressors. So this isn't about bubble wrapping kids, but it's about giving them appropriate, manageable stressors that they can learn to cope with, and that are supported at all levels: familial, political, economically. And we think about some of the features of resiliency being the ability to have and to tolerate and regulate emotions. So this isn't about never feeling overwhelmed, never feeling anxious, never feeling sad, but it's about being able to experience those emotions and regulate them so that they don't become so overwhelming that they impact you in a problematic way. It's the ability to still solve problems under stress, right? So not just shutting down, to have meaningful, healthy relationships with others, to have a realistic and positive sense of competency. So to both have people recognize what they can do and to sort of not feel helpless, but not overestimate and feel like they have to do everything and can do everything. So really kind of knowing your limitations in a realistic way, and having a sense of future orientation, feeling like your life is meaningful, that there's a purpose to it over time. We also recognize that social support is a key aspect of resiliency. And although I'm going to be talking a lot about individual training, I really want to emphasize that this is not something that we think can be done in isolation. We need each other. We need supportive families and communities and peer groups and schools for kids to be resilient. And some of the aspects are the size and the extent of the social network. But more than that, the sense that the social network is meeting the child or the individual's needs, right? Which can be a little bit different for different people. And then often, there may be sort of more pragmatic aspects of social support, like material support or advice or guidance, and obviously feeling loved or cared for. And we also know that communities matter. So so having models for coping, people to look up to, people that reflect key aspects of you that you can say as a kid, I want to be like that person. That's who I see myself being when I grow up or as I grow up, and having a sense of belonging and pride and purpose, and also again having basic needs met, having food and shelter and safety are key elements without which I think it's unfair to ask people to have internal resiliency. So what are some of the strategies? So let me get into some of the things that we're working on. So at the community level, which we are working, like making sure that there are policies and practices that basic health needs are being met, that we're addressing any systemic health disparities, that we are offering supports in ways that reach individuals who need it. So something that we've really been focusing a lot is on using, whether it's going to communities that need our support, or using telehealth, so that we're not expecting people to come to us all the time, because I think that's an unfair burden and just not that's a disparity. Making sure that we provide support for parents and families, making sure that we increase the social supports for families, not just kids, that we collaborate with teachers and community leaders and community centers, and also some pragmatic things like teaching coping skills to parents and other adults. We're working a lot in schools and boys and girls clubs and other community groups, so that all the adults know the skills themselves, can practice them, and then model them. And then really limiting pandemic related news. I think we need to protect our kids a little bit from what they're seeing all the time through various media. For individual skills, and I'll get into some of these a little bit more, we want to make sure that kids can recognize symptoms of stress and learn to tolerate and understand negative emotions, and teach some of the skills that we know can reduce the stress response, and really enhance things that people are already doing. Kids come to the table with sort of innate resiliency, and so we want to foster those traits as well. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been doing online groups since the pandemic started. We have anywhere from 5 to about 12 kids per group, and we have separate groups for elementary, middle, and high schoolers, and we've been doing some work with college as well. The groups are very low cost or free, because we don't want finances to be an impediment to people getting these skills. And we focus on some of the tools that I'm about to describe in a little bit more detail. We've been doing them over 6 weeks, once a week for about 45 minutes, and they've gone very well, and the response has been quite positive. It's definitely been a learning curve for us. We were learning how to do all this on Zoom, and I think it's something that we're going to continue doing long after the pandemic wraps up, because it's so much more accessible than doing it in person. So one of the first things that we do is ask kids about, defining stress. So how would you define it? Can stress ever be a good thing, right? As I talked about, that there's a certain amount of stress that is healthy and motivating, helps you learn how to solve problems and cope. But then really thinking about, when does stress become a problem? This is just my little clip. The trouble with you, David, is that you don't know what the word relax means. So that kind of perpetual tension, even when you're supposed to be, in theory, relaxed in a hammock. And then we provide some of the science, because I think it's helpful to understand why people are experiencing what they're experiencing. So we all know about the fight or flight or freeze response, which is innate. It's a survival skill. It's a really good thing. It's what keeps us alive, right? So if you think about, if you're sitting in the middle of the road and a truck is coming at you, what might you do? Well, your body is automatically going to kick in with this fight or flight or freeze response, hopefully not the freeze in this case, and get you out of the way. The problem is, when that's happening chronically, or when that's happening in situations where there isn't a direct immediate threat, that's when we start to see a lot of the less helpful symptoms. right? So we actually will talk with kids about this and show this slide even. So, when you have that fight or flight response, that stress response, your heart rate goes up, your blood flow goes to your major muscle groups, so you can either run away or fight whatever's coming at you. Your breathing goes up, your digestion gets inhibited because you don't really need to be digesting food if you're trying to run away from something. You start to sweat, both so you can stay cool and possibly be slippery. Your pupils dilate, right? So automatically your body kicks into all of this. What that, however, can translate to when that's happening chronically are things like muscle aches and headaches, upset stomach, tightness, that kind of constant tension in your neck or shoulders. Sometimes people feel like their heart is racing or they're breathing too quick and then they're getting dizzy because they're hyperventilating. It can be hard to sleep, right? Because you're not really supposed to be sleeping if there's a danger, but when that's happening chronically and you're not sleeping habitually, then that is a problem, and you'll also end up feeling very tired. We also know there's a behavioral warning signs, and we highlight this because often people misunderstand, and adults can misunderstand for kids why they are doing certain things, right? So often it can be hard to focus on important things. There's a lot of avoidance and kind of trying to numb out, whether that's with substances or food, or for many kids, kind of mindlessly being on some sort of screen or device to try not to think, not to feel. For some people, they can be very irritable. We always forget, I think, about the fight part of the fight or flight, right? And some kids or young people, when they're stressed and anxious, get argumentative and fighty and oppositional, and parents and adults might be kind of confused about what's going on. There's also sometimes an apathy that can happen, that over time you lose your motivation, you lose your enthusiasm when you're in that stress response. And that's when we sometimes have kids come in sort of labeled as slackers or unmotivated or not engaged. And that's been a huge thing through the pandemic, as particularly as online school has gone on. We've been hearing a lot about that, which makes sense. There's cognitive warning signs. So it's hard to concentrate and focus, make decisions. Again, that loss of interest or numbing that I was talking about, this worry, this sort of negative self-talk, kind of hopelessness or pessimism about the future. These are all very common cognitive signs of this prolonged stress. And then sort of what we think about as spiritual stress warning signs. So losing a sense of purpose and meaning, having a hard time being kind, empathic, thinking about others, feeling connected to them. There's sort of like a blahness and a disconnection that a lot of people describe. And then a focus on sort of immediate, like what can I do, to try to bring some kind of spark of momentary joy, which can be, again, some of these short-term things, whether it's substances or buying things or, playing video games. It's kind of, trying to replace things that big picture are meaningful with kind of short, quick fixes. And so the way we think of it is that in an adaptive response to stress, what happens is that there's a stressor and then you go back to baseline, right? Your nervous system kind of goes back. And then there maybe is another stressor, but you have a chance to go back to baseline. And in maladaptive stress, what happens is the set point keeps going up and up and up. So that there's a stressor, you never get back to baseline. So you're kind of more aroused, and then there's another stressor. And so you kind of keep going up and up and up. And that's when stress becomes problematic. So the question then for us is, what can we do to help bring that nervous system back to baseline so that the arousal decreases enough so you're not constantly kind of in some sort of fight or flight mode. And we show this kind of slide where the three ways that we're going to intervene are with tools to reduce the physical stress response. We're going to try to recognize unhelpful thought patterns and generate more helpful ones. And we're going to think about behaviors that we can use that will actually help improve the situation, whether that's problem solving or using healthy coping skills as opposed to sort of short-term fixes. So one question that we ask early on in our groups is there something I can do about the stressor? And I always sort of joke a little bit because I was very proud of myself for having come up with this. And then I realized I basically just ripped off the Serenity Prayer, but there's a lot of merit in it and it's still really good because we want to differentiate, is there something I should be action focused or not? And knowing that difference is pretty key. So if there is something that can be done about the stressor directly, then we want to use problem solving. and we teach kids how to do this. A lot of kids think, oh, I already know how to solve problems, but this is very systematic, where we identify what the problem is, we brainstorm at least more than one potential solution without judging it in the moment. And then only when we've come up with a range of solutions do we evaluate the pros and cons of each to come up with a plan, and then we implement the plan and evaluate the results. Now, if the answer to that question of, is there something I can do about the stressor, is no, which is often the case for a lot of the things that we've been facing, especially recently, then this is when we want to use some alternative tools to reduce our stress. So we want to use some of our relaxation, breathing, mindfulness strategies, which I'll talk about. We want to kind of help tolerate the uncertainty of it, right? We want to use sort of mindfulness and acceptance skills and positive self-talk to kind of get through it. And in some cases use distraction, but again, in a healthy way. And so this is where we start to introduce the relaxation response. So the relaxation response is the opposite of the fight or flight response. And in the relaxation response, heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down, breathing rate goes down, muscle tension is reduced, our adrenaline, cortisol levels go down, and over time that helps with memory and concentration. And the key way to do this is through managing breathing, which I'll walk you through in a second, but also the focus on a repetition. It turns out, so really when we're talking about meditation, and when I use that word, some kids are like, oh, I don't want to sit there and do my Zen, which that's one way to elicit, but at the core, what you're actually doing is just focusing your mind on something repetitive and bringing your mind back to that time and time again if you get distracted. So I'll walk you through some of these, and actually we'll practice some of these skills together, but we know that you're going to get distracted. It's just like, oh, well, and you bring yourself back. And then if another thought or sound or something happens, oh, well, and you bring yourself back to whatever the repetition is. So one of the things that we ask are, what kinds of repetitions do you find relaxing and calming? Because certainly, doing traditional meditation with a mantra is one way to do it, but there are many other ways that people can achieve this that might work better for them. So for some people, it's through physical activity, right? So bouncing a basketball or swimming or running. For some people, it may be through music or through art or through other activities where you're immersed in the moment. It may be prayer. So really helping people recognize that there's many, many different ways to achieve this. The core thing to remember, though, is that you want to actively bring this on. So the stress response is automatic. There's nothing that you need to do to bring that on. But the relaxation response is voluntary and requires active practice. So we're going to want to use some of the repetitions that people are already doing kind of naturally and that are appealing to them, but really map it out so that they're doing it systematically and purposefully to elicit the relaxation response. So some of the ways that we practice in our groups and that we practice actively are through diaphragmatic breathing, which I'll talk about in a second, and a number of these other tools. And our goal is to give kids a menu of options. Some people will prefer one or another. And so it's really allowing them to try various strategies so that they can pick and choose the one or the ones that work the best for them. So just kind of quickly, when we're talking about diaphragmatic breathing, we're talking about a couple of things. So the reason diaphragmatic breathing is helpful is that when you expand your diaphragm, which is the muscle underneath your rib cage, that activates a nerve called the vagus nerve, which runs up to your brain. And the vagus nerve is what brings on the relaxation response. So it's what gets triggered. So after you've had your fight or flight response, thank goodness we have a strategy to help reduce that. So it's not as though if you get your fight or flight response activated once, you're in that mode forever. So there's a whole kind of activation called the parasympathetic nervous system that gets activated. That's what allows you to get back to baseline. And the vagus nerve is what controls that. And so when you expand your diaphragm, you trigger the vagus nerve, and then that helps bring on that sort of decrease in stress response. It's also helpful because, as I mentioned before, when we're in stress, we tend to breathe more rapidly and more shallowly, and that kind of perpetuates that anxious. It's telling your body, oh my gosh, you're still in a stress response, you need to kind of be anxious. So by slowing down our breathing, that also helps decrease that stress response. And we also know that when you exhale slowly, that lowers your heart rate. So in fact, the exhale is really what's more important than the inhale. And we sometimes see people, focus so much on taking the very deepest inhale that they can. That's not the most helpful thing. As long as you're sort of breathing from your belly and not sort of breathing shallowly from your chest and you're expanding, you really just want to slow down your exhale. So when we're talking about, sort of diaphragmatic breathing, sometimes what we'll do, and you can't really see, but we put one hand on our chest and one hand on our belly. And what you want to do is see if you can keep the hand on your chest still and expand your belly so that that hand moves up and down. And so we can practice this if you feel up to it. We can do this together where we're going to breathe in for 4. You can hold it for a second and then breathe out for 6. And just do that calmly a few times. And that, it doesn't make all your worries go away, but it's just a good way to start bringing on the relaxation response in an active way. And we'll practice this with kids, with little kids. We might use imagery, like imagining, we ask them what their favorite color is and have them imagine, blowing up a balloon in their belly of that color, like a beautiful purple balloon. Or we might put a beanie baby on their belly and see if they can make the beanie baby go up and down. So it can be fun. And for parents, it's nice to do this as a family activity. So everyone just practices taking a deep breath before kind of jumping into the next step, whether it's in the morning or, before dinner or before homework, just kind of practicing that so it becomes just a part of everyday practice. And the idea is that the more you do these things, and do these things not in an acute moment of stress, but when you're just kind of, in your everyday life, the better you'll be able to do it when you're really anxious and stressed. One of my all-time favorite strategies, and I'm going to do it with you because I think it's always worth doing, and it's really one of the kids' favorite, is what we call just this breathing. And this is one of the ways that we introduce a meditation and a repetition. And what I really like about this is that it's straightforward. You can do it anywhere. It takes just a few minutes. And what we're doing in just this breathing is that you're breathing, not super, super slowly, but just on your slower end. And everyone's breathing is a little bit different. So I'm going to do it with you. And if you are breathing at a different rate, please don't worry about it. And on the inhale, we're going to focus on the word just. And on the exhale, we're going to focus on the number 1. And then we're going to focus on just 2, just 3. Normally we do it up to 10. I'm only going to do it up to 5 just for time's sake. And then when you get to 5, then we're going to switch. And on the inhale, we're going to think this and really focus on that word. And then the number 5 on the exhale, this 4, this 3, all the way down to 1. And then when we get to 1, on the inhale, we're going to think the word just. And on the exhale, this. I'm going to walk you through it. And again, if you get distracted, if your mind wanders, that's okay. Just note it and come back. So I want you all to make yourselves very comfortable. You can I invite you to close your eyes, or if you prefer to keep them open with a soft gaze, that's perfectly okay. I'm going to close my eyes just so that I find that easier to focus. And now I'm going to walk you through, and we're going to focus on our inhale and focus on the word just. Exhale 1. Just. Exhale 2. Just. 3. Just. 4. Just. 5. Now inhale this. Exhale 5. This. 4. This. 3. This. 2. This. 1. Now inhale just. Exhale this. Just. This. Just. This. And you can open your eyes or just sort of stretch it out, wiggle your fingers and toes, and just sort of notice how that was. Was that pleasant? Were there parts that were difficult? I like it because it's repetitive enough to be able to attract focus, but not so complicated that if you get distracted, you can't come back to it easily. And it's, as I said before, one of the tools that a lot of kids really appreciate. Another thing that we focus on is what we call sensory awareness. And again, this is something that you can do. I should know better than to do that relaxation because now I'm all relaxed. Now I've got to gear back up. But now focusing all your attention on your senses. So what's around you? And often we're walking through life without really noticing what's coming in through our senses. And so this allows you to really take a few minutes just to do that. And different people prefer different senses. So you can use whatever sense, or the child can use whatever sense is most pleasant for them, whether it's visual or auditory. And the idea is really to notice and narrate without judging, without trying to change, just what do you hear? Even just now, if you were to take a few seconds, there are probably all sorts of various noises that you're not aware of that you can direct your attention to. Or even, feeling your feet against the ground, like really noticing how the ground is supporting you, how your feet might feel in your shoes, really just noticing for a few seconds. Or if you're eating a food that you really enjoy, taking the time and really noticing the texture and the taste and the flavors and the experience. And so we'll walk through some of that. And what's nice about that is that's also a nice way, it enhances positive experience, but it's also a nice way if someone's really overwhelmed and can't access the other skills, sometimes that's a good way to snap out of that. So for example, in a test situation or before performance, that might be a good way to just kind of calm down enough to be in the moment. We also use a lot of imagery to bring on the relaxation response. So we'll walk kids through what we call a special place, for example. So we ask kids to pick one of their favorite places where they feel calm and relaxed. And then we walk them through, again, using their senses, like what do they see, having them look around and really noting in their mind's eye what they're seeing, what do they hear or feel on their skin. And it's interesting because kids really enjoy this. And what's always striking to me is that the special places that they use aren't usually the typical ones that you might think. So that's, I think, one of the issues with some of the kind of standard relaxation scripts is that they may not really reflect where kids feel the safest and the most relaxed. So very few kids use things like a beach or a mountain. We've had kids have their special place be, their grandmother's house baking cookies or hanging out with a friend outside after school or playing basketball or any of those things. So I think really just asking kids their own individual special places so that they can bring themselves to that place, I think is really powerful. And then we'll often do progressive muscle relaxation, which involves tensing and relaxing various muscle groups, because it turns out that when you kind of purposely tense for a moment and then relax, you actually are able to deepen the relaxation practice. So we'll start, we'll work through all the major muscle groups like hands and arms, shoulders and back, face and jaw, and so on and so on. And that there's a number of scripts that are available both online and through our program. And then what we also focus on is now moving from the physical relaxation components to more of a cognitive or a thought-based one. We help kids recognize unhelpful thoughts because we all have that. We always have these running scripts in our head that have a tremendous impact on how we feel and what we do. And we're not always aware of them, even though they're always present and very powerful. And so what we have kids do is identify what those thoughts are, so start to notice them, and then come up with ways of challenging thoughts that maybe aren't serving them or aren't helpful. So we might have them think about, well, what's the evidence for this thought? Is there another way to look at the situation? In some cases, we might just treat, thoughts as the meaningless experiences that they are. It's just a thought. And then we talk about Coach B, which I'll refer to in a second. So one of the things that we talk about are thinking traps. So we all have these cognitive distortions or thinking traps that impact how we feel. So for example, a lot of people will, kind of only focus on the negative or think the worst, or something that most of us do is think that we know what's going to happen before it actually does, or that we can read other people's minds without them telling us what they're actually thinking and feeling. And it turns out that we're really bad at doing both fortune telling and mind reading. So for example, like, oh, I'm going to fail this test, or my teacher hates me. Those are common ones that come up. That's fortune telling and mind reading. And so helping to just challenge it, and even just to kind of say like, oh yeah, that's my thinking trap, I'm mind reading again, kind of takes some of the power out of those thoughts. For some thoughts, as I mentioned, we just try to be neutral about it. We just, it's just a thought. You have 7,000 thoughts a day, and we want to treat that, scary or upsetting thought the same way that you would have a thought like, oh, it's sunny outside, or I like the color blue, or oh, there's a stain on my rug. Like, okay. And we want to just kind of allow that thought to go by like leaves on a stream, or, like an echo, and not really react to it. Like, yep. And sometimes it comes back around. All right, we're just going to notice it and then let it go out, because the more you try to sometimes fight the thoughts, the more power they have. So we just kind of want to be a little ho-hum if we can about them. This is an example of how to challenge a thought if you do want to challenge it. So, this person had the thought, nobody cares about me. So we were kind of talking about, well, that's seeing the negative. Is there evidence that people do care about me? Is there another way I can think about it? So, I'm feeling badly because I had a hard day. So it's not that, people don't care about me. I need to take care of myself because I'm feeling kind of not so great. We talk a lot about self-coaching. And the idea here is that, we speak to ourselves and we coach ourselves in ways that we would never do with anyone else. So, when we make a mistake, if you think about how do you talk to yourself when you mess up or something doesn't go well, right? A lot of people will say, I'm so stupid. How could I have messed up? I can't believe this. I'm never going to be able to do this. And we call that coaching. And there's a whole coaching story that goes along with that kind of harsh, kind of call it like the Bill Belichick of self-coaching, right? That sort of very harsh, punitive coaching. But if you think about how you either might speak to other people or what kind of coach you would want for yourself or your child, you would never want a coach who berated your child if they missed a play, right? What kind of coach would you want? Well, you would want a coach that acknowledged that it was a mistake, but then gave them tips and tools to do better. One that didn't sort of shatter the child's self-esteem, but kind of help them learn what they needed to do to improve their play. And so that's who we call Coach B. And so we often talk about like, you want to be a Coach B. So this is not about saying everything you do is awesome and you're so great and everybody gets a participation prize, but it's kind of saying like, okay, I didn't do so great, fine. What I want to do differently. And then the last thing that we talk about in the groups is really some of the lifestyle behaviors, like making sure that people are sleeping enough and regularly, that they're getting exercise and that they're eating reasonably well and engaged in social activities and involvement in regular meaningful activities as a solid foundation on which to practice all these other skills. And then we do sometimes, the nice thing is there really are a number of apps that kids and adults can access, and sometimes that can be a helpful adjunct. There's also a lot of YouTube videos and the use of, a lot of wearable technology to kind of track and pay attention to your stress, heart rate, activity levels. So those certainly can also be helpful tools that we certainly encourage people to use. And that is my presentation. So thank you so very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I appreciate your watching and being part of this talk.
Thank you so much. Okay, so for anyone who has questions, please put them in the chat box and I will read them to Dr. Henin and she can answer them. Our first question is, this person has a family member who is taking medication for anxiety. Is there a general tendency to over-medicate?
So that question comes up often. So the data tell us no. In fact, the data tell us that the vast majority of children who need care, including medications, aren't getting them. So I overall no. I think that the data suggests that for many conditions, particularly anxiety, a combination. So for moderate to severe levels of anxiety, the research tells us that a combination of medications and cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be the most effective. There's some things that medication does very well and some things that therapy does very well. And particularly if someone's suffering on the more severe end, integrating the two can be helpful. CBT can sometimes be helpful on its own for lower level anxiety, and possibly as a way to help prevent relapse if someone wants to come off medication over the long run.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Our next question, thank you. Are the Zoom meetings you mentioned for elementary school students still taking place, and how would someone sign up?
Yes, they are. We just started another round right after the break. So a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to continue those, I think, infinitely. I think they're on Monday evenings and Wednesday, I think afternoons. I forget exactly the time, I think 4. And you can go on the, I think right now they're still on Benson Henry website, and soon to be put on our Child Resiliency website. So if you enter a Child Resiliency Group, MGH, you should see that and you can sign up online.
Okay.
And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me as well. Yep.
Okay.
You know what? Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to find it and I'm going to show it, because that probably is the easiest, as opposed to trying to describe it verbally.
Okay.
Give me just a second, if you don't mind. I'm going to try to multitask.
Yeah. And in the meantime, if there are more questions, please send them over.
So here we go. So it's, if you go on Benson Henry Institute, here, let me share my screen again. So just bear with me here. If you can all see that. So it's on the Benson Henry Institute webpage.
Mm-hmm.
You can go find all the information that you need there. And if you need more information, you can contact Simreen Sethi. And this, I don't know if you can see the email, but that'll be the person to reach out.
Would it be possible for you to copy and paste that link into the chat box? For
you know what? That's a great idea. Yes, I think I can.
Thank you.
All the sophisticated technology stuff I'm still learning. Sorry, bear with me. So this is the person's email. And I will copy the link as well, so if people want to look at it. And again, I think we wanted to, I think we're charging something like $50 for the whole thing, but it's also free for any children of employees of Mass General Brigham, and for anyone, no questions asked, who has financial need, and for children of military families as well. So we're doing this.
Great.
And so I'm just trying to paste for some reason it's not letting me paste the website. Oh, very odd. I don't know why it won't let me copy and paste the website. I don't know. I must be doing something wrong. But let me try again.
And I'll go ahead and reshare that email address to everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
There we are.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
Okay, we still have a few more minutes, so if anyone else has questions, please send them through the chat so that we can answer them. And if not, I guess we can wrap up a few minutes early.
You can spend the time to do a few breathing exercises, mindfulness, go look outside at the beautiful weather, look at the flowers and trees.
Those are very helpful.
Yeah, those are great.
Yeah.
And as
It's
I mentioned today, we're recording today's session. So if anyone's interested in viewing the recording, especially if you want to refer back to those techniques, you can view them on the Blum Center website. I'll give it about a couple of weeks for it to get posted, but it'll eventually be there at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center.
Okay.
Well, thank you again.
I don't see any more questions. So again, thank you so much, Aude. This is a great presentation. I think we all learned a lot.
My pleasure. And thank you again for
Yeah,
giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it.
great.
Thank you so much. And everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.